the names that wouldn't die. Before the story gets buried like the others, hit subscribe, tap like, and drop a comment if you think you're ready for what hides behind America's most secure walls. Because once you hear this, you won't unhear it. The call came in at 2:17 a.m. when even the mountains around Florence, Colorado, seemed to be holding their breath. A maintenance worker doing a routine walk near the outer service corridor of ADX Florence noticed something wrong. A door that should never be open was unlocked. No alarms. No alerts. Just a thin crack in steel where there should have been none. By the time federal officers arrived, the corridor was sealed, lights flooding the concrete like a crime scene frozen in time. There was no blood. No struggle. No signs of escape. But there was something worse. A name. Scratched faintly into the dust near the base of the wall, as if someone had taken their time writing it with deliberate care. A name belonging to a man who, according to official records, had died 7 years earlier inside ADX Florence. That discovery triggered an internal alert few people even knew existed. Within hours, senior Bureau of Prisons officials, federal investigators, and a sealed Department of Justice task force were brought in under strict confidentiality. The story was never meant to leave the prison. But secrets have a way of rotting through concrete. ADX Florence isn't just a prison. It's a dead end. The final stop for inmates considered too dangerous to ever rejoin society. Terrorists. Crime bosses. Serial offenders who had proven they couldn't be controlled anywhere else. The place where sentences don't end, they just fade. And yet, buried deep in the administrative logs, investigators found something that made no sense at all. 6 inmates were still listed as active in the system. Not transferred. Not released. Not deceased. Active. The problem? Every one of them was supposed to be gone. Special Agent Daniel Mercer was flown in from Washington under a cover story involving infrastructure audits. Mercer had spent his career unraveling institutional corruption, but even he wasn't prepared for what he saw when he opened the files. Each inmate had a complete paper trail. Intake forms, behavioral assessments, disciplinary reports, monthly health evaluations, all dated years after their supposed deaths. These records weren't forged by amateurs, Mercer said quietly to the prison warden during their first closed-door meeting. They were maintained. Someone had been keeping these men alive on paper. The names shared one thing in common. All had been housed in a decommissioned wing known internally as Unit C0. Officially, the wing had been shut down after a structural incident nearly a decade earlier. Unofficially, it still appeared in the system, hidden behind layers of outdated software and restricted access codes. When Mercer asked to see Unit C0, the room went silent. Even among hardened prison officials, fear crept in. "No one goes down there anymore," the warden finally said. "We were told it was sealed." Told by whom was the question no one answered. As Mercer dug deeper, the timeline grew darker. Each inmate's supposed death coincided with internal investigations that had quietly disappeared. Whistleblowers who retracted statements. Auditors reassigned. One junior analyst who died in what was ruled a hiking accident near the same mountain range that loomed over ADX Florence. Too many coincidences. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, another thread emerged. A journalist named Claire Holloway had been chasing a tip for months. A rumor passed through former inmates and dismissed as prison folklore. The story of men who went into ADX Florence and never came out. Not in body bags. Not in transfer vans. Just gone. When Holloway requested death certificates for several high-profile inmates, she noticed discrepancies. Signatures that didn't match. Autopsy reports missing basic identifiers. And one document stamped approved by an official who, at the time, was on medical leave. She never published the story. Instead, she disappeared. Her car was found abandoned off a rural highway less than 30 miles from the prison. Phone inside. Laptop gone. No signs of forced entry. No ransom demands. Just silence. When Mercer learned about Holloway, the investigation shifted from internal corruption to something far more dangerous. Someone was actively protecting whatever Unit C0 was hiding. Late one night, Mercer reviewed surveillance archives that had never been flagged. Footage from years earlier showed supply carts entering restricted elevators with no corresponding exit logs. Cameras would glitch for exactly 4 minutes at a time. Always the same window. Always the same elevator. Someone had designed the system to forget. And then there was the sound recording. A distorted audio file buried in a maintenance database. Static-filled. Almost discarded. Until Mercer boosted the volume. A man's voice, calm but exhausted, speaking directly into what sounded like a wall. "They told us we were never leaving," the voice said. They didn't mean the prison. They meant the world. The recording cut out abruptly. No date. No name. Only a location tag. Unit C-0. Authorization was granted the next morning under extreme pressure from Washington. A small team escorted Mercer through a forgotten service tunnel sealed behind false walls and obsolete signage. The air grew colder as they descended. The lights flickered on one by one, illuminating a corridor that should not exist. Cells lined the walls. Occupied. Inside were men older than their records. Faces etched with years that had never been counted. Eyes that locked onto Mercer with something between hope and warning. One inmate stepped forward, gripping the bars. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "If they know you've seen us, you won't leave either." Mercer asked the question that had haunted him since the first name appeared in the dust. "How long have you been here?" The man smiled, slow and hollow. "Officially," he replied, "we've been dead for years." Then the lights went out, and somewhere above them, a security override was activated, one that sealed Unit C-0 from the rest of the prison entirely. But what Mercer didn't know yet was far more terrifying, because the next file he would uncover would prove that Unit C-0 wasn't a mistake. It was a program, and it was still running. The program beneath the prison. When the emergency lights snapped on, they revealed a truth even worse than darkness. The cells of Unit C-0 weren't temporary holding spaces. They were permanent. Reinforced doors thicker than standard ADX steel. Observation slots sealed from the outside. Cameras embedded behind smoked glass, angled not to monitor behavior, but to study it. Mercer's escort team stood frozen, hands hovering near weapons they knew were useless in a place that wasn't supposed to exist. The inmates didn't shout. They didn't rush the bars. They simply watched, as if this moment had been rehearsed long before Mercer ever arrived. A siren never sounded. Instead, a calm automated voice echoed through the corridor. Containment protocol initiated. Mercer understood then. This wasn't a lockdown to protect the prison. It was to protect what was hidden inside it. He demanded immediate extraction, but the radios crackled with nothing but static. Someone had cut external communications cleanly and professionally. Whoever designed Unit C-0 had planned for discovery. Inside one of the cells, an older man sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. He spoke without looking up. "They'll let you see just enough to think you can leave," he said. "That's how they get you to stop asking questions." Mercer moved closer. "Who are they?" The man finally raised his eyes. Everyone who signed the papers and pretended not to read the fine print. Over the next hour, fragments of the truth spilled out, carefully, cautiously. The inmates of Unit C-0 weren't random. Each had once held leverage, knowledge, connections, evidence that could unravel powerful institutions if released. They were supposed to be silenced quietly, but someone had a different idea. The program began as a classified behavioral experiment shortly after a series of national security failures shook Washington. The premise was simple and dangerous. Study the psychology of irredeemable criminals under total isolation, total control, and indefinite detention, beyond legal oversight. Officially, the inmates died. Unofficially, they became data. Patterns of obedience, resistance, mental collapse, compliance under prolonged pressure. The kind of information that never appears in court filings, but circulates in closed rooms where ethics are treated as optional. Mercer felt the weight of it settle into his chest. This violates every law on the books. One inmate laughed quietly. That's why it's still here. Above ground, The consequences were already unfolding. At DOJ headquarters, a junior analyst reviewing Mercer's access logs noticed something wrong. His clearance had been downgraded mid-investigation without authorization. That change could only have come from someone with executive-level privileges. Someone watching in real time. Claire Holloway's disappearance suddenly made sense. She hadn't been silenced because she was wrong. She was silenced because she was early. Mercer found her name buried deep in a restricted digital annex, flagged as a civilian exposure incident. No death certificate. No closure report. Just a note marked resolved. Back in Unit C-0, a heavy mechanical sound rumbled through the walls. The inmates stiffened. "They're moving the files," one whispered. "They always do when outsiders come too close." Mercer demanded access to the prison's internal servers. After tense negotiations, a single terminal was activated under supervision. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The program had expanded. Other facilities. Other units. Different names. Unit C-0 was not an anomaly.
It was a prototype.
As Mercer scrolled through encrypted directories, one file caught his eye, a recent update timestamped just 3 days earlier. Status: active. Subject count: 7. 7 inmates. But Mercer had only counted 6. Before he could ask, alarms finally erupted above ground. Not in Unit C-0, but across the main facility. Guards scrambled. Doors sealed. The prison shifted into full containment mode. Someone was creating a distraction. In the chaos, Mercer felt a presence behind him. One of the inmates stood outside his cell.
Free.
No broken locks. No forced entry. Just an open door. "You weren't supposed to see me yet," the man said calmly. "But plans change." Mercer's hand tightened. "How did you get out?" The man smiled. "That's the wrong question. The right one is how long I've been walking these halls." Before Mercer could react, the inmate leaned closer and lowered his voice. "They don't keep us here because we're dangerous," he said. "They keep us because we're useful." Footsteps thundered in the distance. The man stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into a side corridor that shouldn't have connected to anything. When the guards finally arrived, they found Mercer alone. And every terminal wiped clean. The official report would later state that Unit C-0 contained no living inmates. That Mercer had suffered from stress-induced hallucinations. That Holloway's investigation had no credible basis. But one thing couldn't be erased. That night, a classified memo was transmitted to multiple federal agencies under emergency encryption. Subject line: Program Exposure Risk, Level Red. And at the bottom of the document, a final line chilled everyone who read it. Containment failure imminent. Subject 7 is unaccounted for. Because whoever Subject 7 was, he hadn't just survived ADX Florence. He had escaped it. And he knew exactly who helped build the program that was supposed to keep him buried forever. The ones who were never meant to exist. By the time dawn broke over the Colorado mountains, ADX Florence was already rewriting history. Internal memos labeled the night's events as a containment drill anomaly. Surveillance footage from the lockdown vanished into a classified archive. Guards were reassigned. Logs were corrected. Unit C-0 was officially declared empty, sealed, and structurally unsound. Daniel Mercer was escorted out under armed supervision and placed on administrative leave before his plane even touched down in Washington. No charges. No explanation. Just silence. But the silence didn't last. 3 days later, a body was discovered in a federal office building in Virginia. Not a crime scene the public would ever hear about. The deceased was a senior compliance officer who, years earlier, had signed off on a temporary detention protocol tied to ADX Florence. There were no signs of forced entry. No theft. No struggle. On the desk sat a single manila folder. Inside it was one page. A printed name. One of the inmates from Unit C-0. The message was unmistakable. They weren't forgotten. They were counting. Mercer watched the news from his apartment, knowing better than to trust what wasn't being reported. His phone buzzed once, then went dead. A burner device, slipped into his coat pocket by an inmate during the chaos in Unit C-0, vibrated to life. One message. They're closing the circle. You were never supposed to walk out. Mercer didn't respond. He packed instead. Across the country, people tied to the program began to disappear from public life. Retirements announced without explanation. Medical leaves that never ended. A private contractor involved in behavioral data analysis was found dead overseas in what local authorities ruled an accident. The pattern was clear. Someone was dismantling the architecture of Unit C-0 from the inside. And Subject 7 was at the center of it. Mercer finally received proof of what the program truly was when an encrypted drive arrived at his doorstep. No return address. Inside were internal recordings, not experiments, but meetings. High-level officials discussing inmates as assets. Debating which ones were too dangerous to release and which could be repurposed. One voice stood out in every file.
Calm. Precise.
Unmistakably in control. Subject 7. He had never been just an inmate. He had been a consultant. Years earlier, Subject 7 had offered intelligence in exchange for survival. Names. Networks. Operational insight that helped dismantle criminal organizations across borders. But the more valuable he became, the more dangerous it was to ever let him leave.
So they faked his death.
And kept using him. Until he realized he was never going to be released. That's when the program stopped being a prison. And started becoming leverage. Mercer finally tracked him down through a ghost signal bouncing across outdated surveillance nodes. A deliberate breadcrumb. Subject 7 wanted to be found. The meeting took place in an abandoned industrial park outside Denver. No guards. No weapons drawn. Just two men standing across from each other as the sun dipped behind rusted steel. They're calling you a threat, Mercer said. Subject 7 smiled faintly. They always do when control slips. You killed them, Mercer said. One by one. I exposed them, he replied calmly. They chose what followed. Mercer understood then. Subject 7 wasn't trying to escape justice. He was erasing a system that had erased him first. They'll hunt you forever, Mercer warned. Subject 7 nodded. Not forever. Just until the last file is gone. He handed Mercer a flash drive. This is everything. Names. Orders. Authorization chains. If you release it, Unit C-0 can't exist anymore. And you? Mercer asked. I was never meant to exist, Subject 7 said. That makes me hard to catch. By the time federal agents arrived, Subject 7 was gone. The files were released anonymously 2 weeks later. Congressional hearings followed. Oversight committees demanded answers. Officials denied knowledge, blamed predecessors, cited national security. No one admitted responsibility. Unit C-0 was publicly dismissed as a misinterpreted archival error. But the damage was done, because people had seen the names. And some of those names were still breathing. Years later, ADX Florence remains operational, unchanged on paper. No mention of Unit C-0. No acknowledgement of the inmates who were never released, never transferred, never buried. Daniel Mercer resigned quietly and vanished from public life. Claire Holloway's body was never found. And every so often, a government database flags an impossible anomaly. An inmate listed as active. With no location, no cell, no death record. Just a note buried deep in restricted access files. Status: uncontained. They thought the danger ended when the doors sealed shut. But the truth was far worse. Some inmates never left ADX Florence. And at least one of them learned how to walk away. If this story got under your skin, you're not ready for the next one. Subscribe to the channel because some secrets don't stay buried, and the darkest cases are still waiting to be told.